Hey, John.
Hey, Keita.
It's been a while.
Been a while.
It's been a while. We haven't talked in a while. How have you been?
Okay. May I whine for a moment?
Absolutely.
All right. I don't know if you probably saw me mention this on social media, but I recently had a medical issue. As you know, I play hockey, and I injured my elbow repeatedly last winter. The ice was not good for some of our games. And, this is a no-check league, but sometimes the ice has potholes in it. Sometimes you hit a pothole and you go flying. And I don't wear elbow pads, even though my teammates keep telling me I'm an idiot. Well, it turns out I am an idiot because I banged the shit out of my elbow repeatedly, and it got inflamed, it got infected, and it became septic, which means that there was an infection spreading through the rest of my body.
Yeah.
I became really feverish, and I had to go. I'd already seen doctors, and they'd all said, "Yeah, you need surgery on this." I said, "I don't feel like having surgery." And then, I had sepsis. I had fever and chills. I was hallucinating, and so I went to the hospital here in Hoboken, and I ended up staying for 4 days, intravenous antibiotics, and had surgery on my elbow. So that's what it looks like now. And that looks really good. The scar goes like, it's about 5 inches. It was held together by metal staples, and then the doctor pulled that out. So the reason I bring this up is because, I dwell on death a lot and mortality, but in a kind of abstract philosophical way.
Right.
And, I figure if you're a serious thinker, you got to think about death, right? But fuck, man. Sepsis is serious. And so I've really been thinking about death a lot. and the frailty of the body and what it signifies for us thinking, feeling creatures, especially as we get older. How do we deal with it? Death can arise, can come at any instant. Yeah. Life is risky, less so for some of us than others, less risky than it was. But there it is. Death comes for all of us eventually. And so what do we do about it? And I'm still absorbed in quantum mechanics. And so I'm thinking about death in the framework of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics, and which sounds kind of pretentious, but actually it's right there. Death is right there all the time. All those physicists are mortal.
Right.
They're worried about death too. They all think that they're rational, but I've become more and more convinced that a lot of our deepest theories of physics, which are supposedly totally objective and rational and reflect the true structure of the universe, are loaded with wishful thinking, and our attempts to console the physicists about their own mortality. Although most of the physicists, if I said this, would say, fuck you, that's not true. There's no wishful thinking at all in our theories.
Wait, so you're saying that in quantum physics, there's you can read it as a way to try to escape death, try to console the human being with regarding the topic of death?
Yeah, there's a principle that goes even deeper than quantum mechanics. That spans all of physics, classical and quantum. It's a conservation law, conservation of information. We might have even talked about this before. I wrote a column about it for Scientific American. So there are all these different conservation laws, conservation of momentum and energy and matter,
Right.
and all of them have kind of qualifications. But there's some physicists, especially this guy Leonard Susskind, whose books I've been reading, a major theoretical physicist. He says that the conservation of information is like the ultimate conservation law. And it implies, it's very abstract, but it implies that information is never lost. So that everything in your life, all your hopes and dreams and fears, the things that you learn, the things that you forget, never are forgotten. They are preserved in the fabric of reality in some way. And a super intelligent entity in the future, if it understands the laws of physics well enough, should be able to reproduce everything that happened to you and all your thoughts, no matter how far into the future you go.
So the basic formulation of, like a generic formulation of a conservation law is, if it's like the conservation law of energy, is energy does not appear, it doesn't disappear, right? It only changes its status or whatever, its form. And so what you're saying is the same kind of thing applies to information itself. And when we say it doesn't disappear, it's not just that it takes, it becomes new information, but you're saying that the old one is somehow conserved in the new form. And so you can always there's a backup, there's a history of what information used to be.
It's not that like the recording of this conversation will be preserved infinitely, and like a trillion years from now. It's more that you can look at any current state of the universe and retrace its entire history from that knowledge. This is actually an old idea. It came up in classical physics. There was a guy named Laplace who stated it very, very clearly, to know that the ultimate goal of science is to know the present so well that you know all of the past and all of the future. Sounds like a crazy idea, like, delusional, but many modern physicists absolutely take it seriously and see it as, according to Susskind, the most important principle in physics. I see it as just completely delusional and just a classic case of wishful thinking and an attempt to make everything that happens to us matter forever. The problem with mortality, if you believe in God, God remembers everything. God sees everything and keeps a memory of it. And so in that sense, everything that happens matters, the smallest sparrow falling, and as however the Bible put it. But, if you don't believe in God, you have to confront, what the existentialists were worried about, which is that the end of things renders them meaningless. But the conservation of information is like a substitute for God. Anyway, this is the kind of shit that I'm thinking of recently as a result of my stupid elbow.
First off, are you fully recovered? Are you okay now?
I'm going to rehab right after this conversation. Yeah, I'm getting back. I can't do push-ups anymore, but I've got mobility and I can do stuff. So yeah, I'm going to be fine. My goal is to be playing hockey and bothering people.
Are you going to be wearing
on the ice.
Elbow pads?
Yes.
That's good.
Yes.
All right. So this is very interesting what you're saying about death and conservation of information. I have a bunch of different directions to take it in. One, I think you'll just find it interesting. I don't think I've talked to you about these people called the Russian cosmists. Have we talked about this?
I'm sorry, what's the term? Russian?
Cosmists, like from cosmos.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
So this is a peculiar train of thought in Russian philosophy, Russian thought generally, that starts with this guy called, I hope I'm not misremembering his name, Evgeny Fedorov. The last name is definitely Fedorov. I should have looked it up. He was a contemporary of Tolstoy, and he was a librarian in Moscow. A kind of like, they called him, one of the nicknames was Moscow Socrates. He was this like humble origins, humble life. Tolstoy was in complete awe of him because he thought that he is actually living out what a good life is supposed to be. He's very humble. He doesn't have a large ego. He helps other people, this and that, and he is like this deep thinker. Fedorov, there's an anecdote where closer to the end of Tolstoy's life, they had some conversation where Tolstoy was giving him some sort of his own, philosophical ideas. And the two things that I remember, one is Tolstoy said that, at the end of his life, he looked at his earlier work as a waste of time. Like, I would never write Anna Karenina again. This is just, not something that you should engage with, just fiction. And he said something like, if, I would burn those books or something, like I would like to have never written them. And Fedorov allegedly hit him on the head for saying that, because for Fedorov, he had this obsession with retrieving the past, with preserving the past. He thought he had this vision of museums as the temples of the future. And his grand project was, he didn't have any kind of science for it, but he thought that in the future, there would be, science would make advances that would make it possible to go into outer space and to find small, tiny remnants of everybody who has ever lived. And our task as a species is to find all of these tiny remnants and resurrect everybody who's ever been alive. The thing that got me, when I was reading this, that there's always, in these like weird worldviews, there's usually a moment, like a particular turn of a thought that makes me go, okay, this is really, out there in a way that makes me actually sort of buy it. Like there's a weird paradox. Like it has to be sort of absurd for me to fall in love with the idea. And the turn that I loved in his approach is, he said, if science is to evolve further, we will get better at preserving health. We will get better at living longer. Eventually, we will probably find a way to live forever. And if we achieve that through scientific means, if we achieve immortality, and we just take that gift, like the generation that figures that out is going to live forever, and all of the previous generations, are just out of luck because they weren't in that age when this happened, then the generation that got the gift of immortal life does not deserve that gift. If you ever achieve immortality through science, it is, you should be there, like alongside with scientific progress, there should be moral progress. And if these two things are on par with one another, then once you achieve immortality, you should also achieve a state of mind that would preclude you from just becoming immortal without trying to resurrect everybody who got you there. All of these previous generations who made it possible for you to make this final breakthrough.
What's this guy's name again?
Fedorov. Let me make sure that the name I gave you is correct.
And what's his time period? This is like early 20th century?
No, this is 19th century. Nikolai Fedorov is his name. Evgeny Fedorov is a singer in a band, I think. Nikolai Fedorov, and he was born 1829. He died in 1903. So he was a very sort of futuristic thinker for his time.
Okay, that if I may, I just have to say, this guy anticipated to a remarkable degree the whole singularity project. Yeah. So there's a crazy physicist named Frank Tipler who wrote a book. He wrote a bunch of books, but the book that sounds the most like Fedorov is called The Physics of Immortality. And Tipler says that it should be our goal to understand reality well enough that we can turn the whole universe into a gigantic computer that then resurrects every single creature that has ever lived and recreates their lives, except it makes them better. It makes them happier. So it's like a project for turning the universe into heaven, mm-hmm. right? And that sounds like that's what this guy was talking about.
Sounds
of course,
very close. Yeah,
it's not that remarkable a coincidence, since both of these are related to Christianity.
Right.
You know, the whole idea of moral improvement, with the final goal being everybody going to heaven and living happily ever after.
There is, how should I put it? When I think about this, and it's related to what you said earlier about just conservation of information, I'm trying to understand if I get it correctly, and if I do, then if I agree with it. And I think my thinking must have been influenced by Buddhism to a significant extent. And so when we talk about preserving, like if I am a stream of information, and we talk about preserving what I am past when this body dies, you can try to, like, you can cling to me as this human being with my personality traits, with the body in which all of this is sort of defined, right? Or you can, if I have children, let's say, then half of my DNA is in them, and then if I am, so in Buddhist terms, I think I probably misrepresenting Buddhism here too, but there's this idea of everything is just a flow of causes and consequences. And so what I am is the stream of events that has causes. And when this body dies, there will be still traces of what this body has done over its lifetime. And in some way, you could look at those traces as the continuation of what I am now. And so you don't really need to resurrect that person to still claim that, that's around. If you look at a person as this flow of events, or you can take a step further back and say that everything is a flow of events, and a particular person is simply a process within a larger process. And so I'm trying to point to this issue of, do you need to, cling on to particular previous stages of an evolution of a system, let's say, to claim that nothing ever went away? You can point to the system just being there and say that its previous stages are embedded in its current stage because the previous stages led to this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. I totally get that. I mean, I am consoled to a certain extent by the idea that, I have children, I have a son and a daughter. I also write shit, and I'm hoping it's pretty abstract, but I feel better if I think that maybe people will be arguing about, the things that I've written after I'm dead. Part of this motivation, though, it's called the -1 law. That's the conservation of information, because there's a first and second law, and then there's a zero law, and the conservation of information. Susskind wanted to make it the most fundamental, so it's the -1 law. Anyway, it's motivated in part by looking, as physicists and cosmologists do, at the really far future. So within, I think, I forget what it is, like 4 billion years or so, the Earth is going to, our sun is going to become a red giant, and it's going to incinerate the Earth. All right. Maybe we will have fanned out through the universe by then. Maybe we won't. I mean, I think it's reasonable to conclude that humanity won't be here that long, given our self-destructive tendencies. I'm an optimist, but, I try to be a realist as well. So it's looking beyond, like far beyond any possible kind of continuation of humanity and our descendants, and at the ultimate fate of the universe, which right now looks like heat death, like cold, endless nothingness in which nothing can possibly ever happen. That really, it's like the death, it's like the death of death. It's a death so complete that you don't even have death, because there's nothing to die. So, and that really, like I said, if you're inclined toward existentialism, that's a pretty chilling thought. And, but according to the conservation of information, even in that state, there might be the possibility of reconstruction of what had happened before.
How would that work? How does that possibility?
I don't know. I mean, I wrote a piece about recently about scientists' views of the really distant future, like how we could handle heat death. There are 3 physicists who've written about this and suggested ways to get around heat death and continue thinking. One is Freeman Dyson, who's like the dean of, ultra far future speculation. Roger Penrose, another incredibly imaginative, talented physicist. He actually thinks that when you get to heat death, this absolute, eternal, infinite vacuum, that's an unstable state that can somehow shatter and create a new Big Bang. It's kind of speculative. Talk about wishful thinking, but it's a cool idea. And he thinks that we might be able to preserve some kind of record of this, what's happened in this universe, that can be carried over into the next one. And then the other one is David Deutsch, again, another like sort of crazy imaginative physicist. And he believes in the many worlds theorem.
I was about to ask.
He thinks that science, and he's got various schemes for not just information being preserved forever, but the quest for knowledge being eternal and something that's passed down even from one universe to another. But it's all like, hand wavy, highly speculative, but it's cool and it's reassuring. Even though I think it's all bullshit, it makes me feel good that smart people are even worried about this.
I'm not sure that I'm consoled by the idea of everything being preserved forever. I would, where my wishful thinking would lead me is to some kind of place where some things are preserved and others are forgotten forever. Because I'm thinking back to like my adolescent years. I don't want all this shit to be there forever. I had a and this is going to be a weird story. I had a mushroom experience in which it was one of the more sort of it stands out from all of the other mushroom trips because I was alone and the dose was sufficiently high, and I think I had enough experience by that time for the trip to be. It was there were like storylines. There were different elements of the trip that were visually rich and coherent in themselves, and some of them were these just like a whole little movie that I took part in that had a beginning and the end. Maybe not beginning, I'm not sure about that. But there were various different elements there, each of them separate and different from the other one. And one, the most, that had a certain amount of shame connected to it, was this part of the trip where I could see my life as a timeline, as this sequence of events, and I could zoom in to a particular part. And before, it was this weird thing. It was I was at the time I was really into like trying to navigate the experience coming out from some DMT experiences that I have, and on this part of the trip, what I was trying to do is I was going back and forth between looking at the situation, the sort of ordinary way of looking at the situation, like here's a person, he's in a bed, on mushrooms, things are happening, there's a physical body, there's a personality, and all of that. And then I could zoom out to some different level of consciousness where I didn't really exist, like the Nikita Petrov didn't really exist, and there was pure awareness or something. And that was really interesting and pleasurable and everything. But when I got to that part, there was a little bit of or on my way there was a concern about, wait a second, if I go there and this whole thing does not exist anymore, how I feel about death. I was invested in the story. I was trying to, be a good person, do this and that. I was trying to make certain things, achieve certain things, and now that's all gone. And that was that concern was elevated by me going back and forth and realizing that a metaphor that can be used is a spatial metaphor. There's, like I can go from Russia to America. That doesn't mean that Russia disappears then. It continues to exist just without me. And the same kind of thing can apply to these different states or different levels of consciousness. You can be at a place where there is no personality, but the personality still exists in a different sort of part of consciousness. And the same kind of thing, I think in similar terms sometimes about time. Like when you say about the heat death of the universe, that's scary. There's the end of everything. If you think about time as through a kind of spatial lens, there's a timescape the same way there's a landscape, and it's not that scary because there's a part where that somewhere it ends, but it doesn't mean that what has been before disappears. It's just we perceive time in a linear fashion because that's how the species works. But the ultimate nature of time might not be that you have to go from the past to the future sequentially, and there's no way of turning back. It's just how we perceive it. It could be that, it's like there's a border of my body, right? Here, there's the body, and here, there is no body. But the fact that the body ends at some place in the spatial world does not mean that it doesn't exist anymore, right? It's there in a different part of it. So anyway, I'm sorry. I'm it's a long way to get to the story. The story was when I was in that, going back and forth between these different sort of levels of consciousness. on my way back to the personality, to the person on mushrooms in a bed in an apartment, there was this life as a timeline, and I could zoom in to different parts of my life. And I think, or the way it felt is, I was sort of looking at this chain of causes and consequences. So anything that's happening right now is a link in a chain of things that caused it, and this is going to cause more things to happen further. And so I kind of randomly zoomed into a moment in my past that was supposed to, or it felt to me that the part of this exercise was to look at the cause of something that's happening now, though it's not very clear what exactly I was trying to analyze there, like the consequence of what it was that I was zooming into. But what I zoomed into, I think by that time I had forgotten about this moment completely. And when I remembered it and sort of lived through it under the influence of the drug, it did make me think that a lot of my personality probably was shaped at that moment. And the moment was, I was in elementary school and I really needed to take a shit. But the school I was, the toilets were just horrible. No, I don't know if other people ever took a shit in them. I early on decided I'm not going in there. This is just very messy, horrible smell. It's just not a place I wanted to be in. And so I just waited until I can go home. I was also a shy boy, so I couldn't skip school or say I need to go home or just share my conundrum with a teacher. So I just waited. And it was getting uncomfortable and, my stomach hurt or something. So that became apparent to people around me that something's up, but I couldn't say what's up because I was ashamed of the whole thing. I want to take a shit, but I can't go into that bathroom. And so I just sat there stoically with a facial impression that made it clear that something's up. And there was a girl that liked me sitting next to me thinking, Nikita, I can see that something's happening. What can you tell me what's going on? And I said, everything's fine. And she was really concerned. And she talked to other people and said, Nikita, he's not saying what's up, but you can see something is happening. And so in the moment, I was feeling really badly, right? I was hurting. I was also ashamed. What that led to is a real concern on the part of people around me and affection. I could see that they care about me because of that. And moreover, my stoic disposition, it's clearly something's bothering me, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm fine. That led to a kind of respect in their eyes. Something, who knows? Maybe somebody died and I'm just getting through with it and not whining about it. So I got a kind of affection and a kind of respect from being in a shitty, awkward, shameful situation of not being able to deal with basic functions of my body. And so I was simultaneously humiliated and I was physically feeling bad, but I couldn't help but notice that the whole situation is really funny because of the mismatch of these different elements. And so,
yeah.
And so this memory was buried for a long time. And then in this mushroom trip, I remembered it. And that's the kind of thing that I mean when I say, I'm not sure I want everything to be preserved. Of course, I now said the whole story on camera, so I'm making the chances higher that it's going to be preserved. But in the trip, it was funny also to observe in this process of like going back and forth between different states of consciousness, on my way up to the place where there's no personality and it's pure awareness, it was a little scary to think about how I'm going to get to some place where I don't exist. And then, but when I got there, it was no big deal. And then on my way up, or on my way down, there was the opposite kind of concern or fear of, shit being preserved. That memory is still there. That not only the memory is there, but it triggered a chain of events. Like maybe it shaped my sense of humor. Maybe it shaped my understanding of how social realities work. Maybe it's just one of the elements, one of the examples of how I made the dumb decision to not try to make myself feel better, and instead of just for no reason, to nobody's benefit, just patiently deal with the unpleasantness of the situation. Like the whole thing could be avoided easily. I could just leave, but I didn't. And so on my way to that moment, the kind of anxiety-producing part was, I don't want that moment to exist. I want the good moments to exist. But then you get back to being who you are, and it's really not that big of a deal either, because I continue my life. The shameful things that happened in the past, I don't have to be a slave to them. And so I guess what I'm saying is, where the conclusion that I'm getting to is, there's more anxiety and frustration like on your way to a thing, a place, a state of mind, an event, than there is in actually just living it out. Or at least that's, I think, most often the case in my experience.
Well, I have a lot of reactions to what you just. First of all, I think it's close to being a universal human trait to be ashamed of our bodily functions. Right. I know I certainly have that. I know people who seem to be really relaxed about peeing and pooping and things and being naked. But I'm not. And I don't know if that came from my parents or being raised Catholic, whatever. But it seems to me that I think I as I've gotten older, I have looked at a lot of that just as funny.
Right.
Comical. It's part of, the paradox of being human. And so I've tried to deal with it. That's why I started my last book, Pay Attention, with basically a fart joke. Because that's part of the human experience.
I think that's why it's funny. I think the reason this thing is funny is because we make a big deal out of it, though it is clearly not a big deal. Like it's just how the animal functions, and the fact that there's these social constraints about it, and you can shame people or feel bad about it. That's the source of the funny in the situation.
Well, it's also the contrast between, all our noble aspirations, and we're still, we still take shits just like dogs, right? And we still fuck like dogs. Sex also brings in some of these contrasts between the kind of angelic, aspirational part of being human and our biological nature. And it's you gotta include that. in terms of stuff that you want to sort of forget or delete from your experience, I fortunately have not experienced any trauma so profound that I really just wish I could somehow delete that memory. There's a lot of literature about that. Joseph Conrad, the great novelist, he wrote a book called Lord Jim about a guy who was an officer on a ship, and the ship, I think, as I recall, caught fire and it sank very rapidly. And the main character fled the ship. There were still a lot of people on it, and he fled the ship in a lifeboat, and then was accused of cowardice afterwards. And he accused himself of cowardice. And the book is about his attempt to live that down. So that's like a moment of shame that becomes absolutely life-defining. And but even in that case, at least in the novel, it becomes positively transformative. But it still raises the question, would it be, you could conceivably, in fact, this is something that scientists are trying to do now. They're trying to design drugs and processes that can delete traumatic memories. This can be especially effective for soldiers. But what would it mean if they can delete memories of war crimes that make you feel guilty? So there are some really profound moral and philosophical questions that are raised by this, apart from whether it should be preserved in the fabric of the universe and recoverable a million or trillion years from now, your episode of needing to take a crap in the school when you were a kid. It's interesting. I'm, it sort of raises the question of what is life, what makes life worth living? What are the good experiences? What are the bad experiences? Do we want to just have the good experiences and avoid the bad ones? Well, of course we do. But there's this really kind of stupid mass market movie that I thought ended up being kind of profound. I think the title was Fast Forward. It had Adam Sandler as the main character. And there's a magic, this is like 20 years ago or so, there's a magic remote, a TV remote that he discovers that allows him to fast forward, not through movies, but through life. If he expects that there's some boring part of his life coming up, tedious, unpleasant, whatever, he can hit the fast forward and jump ahead to when his life will be more fun. And of course, then the lesson he learns, and it's very schlocky, sentimental Hollywood, the lesson he learns is that you can't skip the bad parts of life because those are important too, that they all matter. And the goal of spirituality should be to help us appreciate that fact and see the kind of, the magic and the miraculousness of even the moment when you're like 12 years old and you're in your school and you need to take a crap and you can't tell anybody and you don't want to go to the bathroom because the bathroom is really disgusting. That's a magical moment. That's an infinitely improbable moment. That's an expression of the creativity of the universe as much as, I don't know, what we're doing right now, or when you're composing some beautiful piece of art, or having an epiphany when you're tripping on mushrooms.
Right. There is that's one of the ways that I look at the creative project and the spiritual project, I think, too. And I think, you can pull metaphors from these like established schools of thoughts, like the alchemical approach to life, where the metaphor of taking prima materiam, just basically shit, and somehow developing a process of turning that into gold, right, through alchemical manipulations. That's a good metaphor for what a lot of art is. You take some moment that's either tedious or boring or shameful or whatever, and you turn it into something else, and you turn it into whatever, a movie that makes people feel connected to other human beings and not alone, and whatever you think is good to cause in this world. And that's a powerful metaphor, a powerful kind of lens through which to look at just life generally. Like, that's what you want to achieve. You take something basic and you elevate it to something else. There was, in that same mushroom trip, I said there were like different, like specific kind of little visions. And one of them was, this was the only trip that I had of this sort, with like these storylines and specific characters. And at the time, I think I've talked to you about this before, there was a DMT trip sometime prior to that in which I discovered that the contents of the trip depend on where in the body the attention is focused. And also sounds, if you're making any kind of sounds, that changes the content of the trip too. So I was trying to observe that as well. And so one of the parts of the trip was I was shifting the attention from one part of the body to another, and was observing what is happening with what felt like the reality I'm in at the time, right? And the two locations, let's call them, that I remember, was one somewhere higher up. I don't remember a particular part of the body because it's hard to maintain this focus on even remembering that there is a body when you're in this like trippy timeline with weird characters. But somewhere higher in the body, there was this fairy tale kind of settings. There was a tower with these wizards in it, and they were doing some kind of magical, like an alchemical kind of thing there. And I kind of stepped into that room and was trying to be, to not be imposing and to be humble about this thing. Like, I'm just going to observe here what's going on there. And they were a little annoyed with me. And there was a clear sense of, they think that their work is so sacred and important, and they're engaged in this, maybe a good metaphor is the alchemical work, magnum opus. This is the thing that's happening, and they're paying all of their attention to it, and they don't need observers from the outside to mess with it, to distract them. And so I was just trying to take a look and sort of humbly observe what is happening. And then so what they were doing, there were some kind of a chemical setup in which some kind of process was happening, and they were attending to that process. They were changing something from one state to another, some substance. And then me, the person, the guy on mushrooms, shifted his attention from this part of the body lower, and the content of the trip changed to, like, I was going down into what can be described as hell, in terms of like fires and some kind of devils there. And it's this fiery, intense realm. There was no like suffering or it was not a bad place for me, maybe because of the mindset. I was not scared by it. But what I saw there is these like demons in a place surrounded by fire, shoveling coal or something, some primal material. The chemical metaphors continue to work here. And the vibe there was, I know there are these entities up in the tower that think this is like, they're involved in a sacred process. We're here at the source. There's nothing sacred about this shit. There's just energy. There's just, this is where it comes from. It's just desire. If I were to speak about it further, I would be putting my, I'm taking the experience and adding interpretations to it. But one way to look at it is, this is what the human experience is. At the source, it's you want to eat, you want to fuck, you want to go to the toilet. It's these drives of a biological entity. And then, yes, you can take all of that, all this basic primal material, and turn it into something else. And it becomes this like highbrow art movie, or a literary masterpiece, or scientific theory. And there's a part of the animal that does look at that as something different, something not connected. We've taken the basic stuff and turned it into something noble and pure and important and meaningful. But at the source, it's still that. It's still you made some operations, you changed the thing into something else, but it's still the same kind of thing. Comes back, I guess, in a way to the conservation law. All the highbrow shit, in essence, continues to be the lowbrow shit.
Yeah. What comes to mind is, I'm glad you tied this back to the conservation laws. One of the really deep issues raised by all the conservation laws, it seems to me, is what do they signify for creativity or novelty? So conservation of information says that there is this something which can be expressed as information, and it goes through lots of transformations, but it's conserved. It's all the same somehow if you measure it in the right way. It suggests that, and this is something that, again, my quantum project has led me to, it suggests that consciousness is not a novelty, that humanity is not a novelty, that everything that exists now, everything that exists in the future that will exist, was latent within reality from the very start. So what does that mean? So, you and I are both fans of the psychedelic philosopher Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna's theology was that there is a creative principle, a divine creative principle underlying reality, and it's producing novelty, like basically crazy shit for us to go, wow, that's fucking amazing. Like Nazis, Hitler, oh my God, I can't believe that. The hydrogen bomb, wow, that's fucking great. COVID-19, are you kidding me? Trump. It keeps things dramatic. It keeps things interesting. It's looking at life as a movie. Well, if everything is conserved, where does novelty come from? Does that mean there are all these parts and you're just shuffling them around in different ways, and there actually is no novelty? There is no genuine creativity? That doesn't seem right. So I think there's something. I understand the conservation laws, and I understand the impulse behind something like the conservation of information. We want things to be preserved, but we also want new shit to happen, to delight us. We want to be able to discover new things. We want to create new theories and new works of art about our experience that actually change us in some kind of fundamental way. And I see that happening. I believe in that. I have faith in that kind of novelty and progress, even though it seems to contradict these conservation laws.
Isn't it?
So that's something I've really been struggling with lately.
Isn't it, dependent on the perspective? Like when you say we want novelty or we want new things to change us and so forth. Well, that's happening in the life of a human. There is novelty, right? But when you talk about like what these physicists are attempting to do is to come up with an objective description of what is going on. An objective means no human observer, though I guess that they're running into some issues there because I don't understand really the principle, the quantum physics issue of the observer effect. And maybe at some point you'll explain it to me better. But if you are trying to get to just an objective description of what is going on, then you don't need like that drive you're talking about. We want novelty to be there. It's there. It can only exist in a way if there's somebody to appreciate novelty. If there is nobody there, then you're just describing one part and the other part, and they're different. And so then if you add the observer who would care about the things being different, then you can, go further from there. But the description itself, again, especially if you think about it in terms of these spatial metaphors, if you think of, you make some kind of a graph of events, I don't know what other concept you want to use there, fields, energy, some kind of substance or energy or information changing and going from one state to another. You can describe some kind of a complex system that maybe is in equilibrium, and you have these processes of the stuff that you're talking about going from one stage to another. But if you're trying to describe it objectively, then you're supposed to keep the conclusions sort of like human conclusions. Does it mean anything or not? Is there novelty or not? All of these things are supposed to be kept away from it, because once you introduce them, then you're not talking about the system in the subjective form. You're talking about the system as perceived by an entity that is experiencing it. It's going through some kind of a trajectory through it.
Absolutely. If you're talking about meaning and progress and things like that, you're assuming that there are conscious observers who care about meaning and progress and things like that as part of the system. Let me just, going back to some of the speculation about the distant future and, the possibility of heat death and the extinction of everything, including all conscious creatures forever. I had in this trip that I've described to you back in 1981, where I felt like I became God, and it was really great, and then it wasn't so great. I had
40 years now.
I was thinking, pardon me?
40 years now. This thing is staying
40 years. I'm still thinking about this goddamn thing. Part of it was that I felt like I was God, but I could die. Mm-hmm. And oh my God, what's going to happen to everything when I die? It's really going to be really bad. But then I had this consoling thought that I can die, my consciousness can be extinguished forever, but once consciousness exists, it will always exist. And all the periods with no consciousness, from the point of view of consciousness, actually do not exist. Right. And so they are spliced together into a seamless timeline, which includes consciousness. And I thought, okay, this is this crazy thing I thought of when I was like tripping my brains out. Roger Penrose basically, just won a Nobel Prize last year, I think it was. He basically, in his speculation about the long-term future of everything, he had essentially the same idea that all the periods of the universe when there is no consciousness, it doesn't matter. That can last for eons. but it goes by in a split second. Things only start to matter and even exist in a sense when consciousness arises again, as it must if consciousness was ever there in the system. That's another consequence of a conservation law. So that's pretty consoling.
Is there such a thing as a conservation law of consciousness? Are people developing theories on that?
If you, this is something I'm trying to work out for my book. I've got a section that deals with this. If the concept of information only makes sense, it assumes the existence of consciousness. There are going to be some scientists who dispute that, I know, but I'm sorry, they're wrong.
Are there scientists who subscribe to this view and disagree with the first group of scientists?
Yeah, I think you'll find people on both sides. My view is that information, as it was originally conceived by the father of information theory, a guy named Claude Shannon, who I actually interviewed, it's about signals. Then you have to define what signals are being passed from a sender to a recipient. The information in a signal is proportional to its capacity to surprise the recipient. This is what Claude Shannon told me. So the subjective state of the receiver, in a sense, defines the information that he's getting. So subjectivity, consciousness are part of the whole system. That's just built into it. So
wait, let me interrupt you for a second. When you say proportional, do you mean like if we're trying to, if there's a measure of information, if there is like a volume of information, and that number is proportional to how surprising it could be?
Yeah, and this can actually be quantified. There are ways to quantify the capacity of a system to surprise you that's related to thermodynamics and entropy, and it can get very technical. But you can quantify this shit. But just to give you a simple example, you just read a story in The Guardian about, protests over COVID policy in Germany or something. And then I tell you, I just read this cool article. I send you the same article. There's no information in the article anymore because you already read it. You've already absorbed the information. You see what I mean? The information isn't an objective quantity. So anyway, to answer your original question, yes, I think that the implication of conservation of information is that consciousness, which is essential for information, is also conserved. Therefore, if there's consciousness now, there must always have been consciousness. There must always be consciousness. So that's a consoling thought as well, but it's built on this, flimsy little piece of wishful thinking that passes as scientific reasoning.
We're at an hour. We'll end here. This is a good place to end. I think that's an interesting trajectory we went through, from your injury through these complex scientific ideas to me wanting to take a shit when I was 10 to what, a statement that is hoping to build toward what a fundamental theory of consciousness. It's interesting dance. Yeah,
man.
All right.
And I think we created something novel here.
Well, that's subjective, right? This was a lot of fun, though. We've taken a break in these conversations, and I'm happy that we're back and we're talking.
Yeah, me too.
All right. So I'm gonna click stop, but we should stay on.